One last final time. Well, maybe not a last final time. Maybe when we review, we might write this out as well. We're going to write out our factoring steps. You need to know this. If you don't know all 5 steps instantly off the top of your head, you need to study these. You need to take 5 minutes at home and have them memorized, because these 5 steps, this is what you do to factor. So if you're in class right now, see if you can write out the 5 steps without looking at anything else. See if you know them. And remember that the order is important. I'm tired of it. Do you know the 5 steps? You got to know them. You got to know them in order. You should think of that every single time. We have really focused on heavily those 3. In the last lesson, we talked about how you can repeat it. This is our very last lesson, and we're going to deal with grouping. I forgot to write this. When do you know you're going to do grouping? If there's 4 terms. If you see 4 terms, you know this is going to be a grouping problem. Next week, we're not going to go like right into the test. We'll take more time to review all of these things. So next week, we'll probably take at least 2 days of reviewing all of this stuff before we end up taking the test. All right. So, but this is it. Now we're going to talk about grouping. One thing that's important to know, and there will be a couple problems on your homework that does this, I still want you to think of common factors first. So the first thing you'll think of still is, are there common factors between all 4 terms? But when we first learn this, we're not going to focus on that. We're just going to start factoring away, and we're going to talk about how to do grouping. All right, let's write this out. I'm going to do an example. 20x squared plus, 20x third plus 8x squared plus 15x plus 6. So again, when you're doing this, you're going to think to yourself, first, is there anything in common? And the answer to this one would be no, right? Is there anything in common between 28, 15, and 6? No, there's nothing in common with all those numbers, and they don't all have x's. So there's nothing in common. Now, we should be able to quickly go through these. Is this a special one? It's clearly not a difference of squares, right? You can tell because how many terms are there? 4. Do you guys know, when do we use cross products? When there's what type of polynomial? A trinomial, right? So we could kind of like skip those pretty quickly because you should know like it's not either of those. So now we go to grouping. This is what it looks like with grouping. I'm going to put a different color in here just to emphasize what we're going to do. You are going to take the first 2 terms and put a parenthesis around them, and the last 2 terms, including the sign, and put parentheses around them. You're going to group them together. Grouping. You're going to group them together. That's the first step. So now we'll talk about steps on grouping. So the first step is to group the first 2 and last 2 terms. Let's write out the word first. So we're going to group together the first 2 terms and the last 2 terms. Just put parentheses around them. Then we're going to factor each of those groups that we made. It's like we turned this one big problem with 4 terms into 2 problems. right? Two little mini problems. And I'll just tell you right now, every time when we do this, we're going to factor with common factors. Each group. So look at this first one. We're going to pretend that that's not there. And we're just going to factor that using common factors. No, I'll put it back, but just pretend it's not there. Between 20 and 8, what's the common factor? What is it? 4. Between x to the third and x squared, what's the common factor? X squared. And then we start the parentheses, right? This is just common factors like we did at the very beginning of the unit. 4 times what makes 20? And then x squared times what makes x to the third? 4 times what makes 8? And then x squared and x squared we already have. We're going to close the parenthesis. Now, when we're done with that, we're going to pretend that all of this is gone. Pretend that none of that is there. And we're just going to factor that one. Between 15 and 6, what's the greatest common factor? 3. So we're going to write plus 3. We'll talk about that sign a little bit later. 3 times what makes 15? And we need an x, don't we? Right? Because it's 15x. 3 times what makes 6? Plus 2. Now, we are going to check to see if the parentheses match. Show you what I'm talking about. If you have done grouping correctly, the terms inside the parentheses should match. Do they match? Yes, they do match. So if they match, then we're going to group them together. Let me talk about what I mean by group them together. Do you guys, now it's been a while since we've done this. This was in the last unit. Do you guys remember when we talked about FOIL or the box? And before we did FOIL or the box, we talked about double distributing. Do you guys remember doing that? We'd have a problem like this. 4x squared plus 3 times 5x minus 2. And before we did FOIL in the box, we did this long way to write it out. We would say, oh, you could do 4x squared times 5x minus 2 plus 3 times 5x minus 2. And we would distribute both of them, and then we would come out with it and then combine like terms. This is the same thing as that. It's the backwards version of that. So when you group them together, what you'll notice is it's just like backwards FOIL or the backwards version of the box, or in this case, the backwards version of double distributing. We can take both of these and put them into one set of parentheses. 4x squared plus 3. And then those that are highlighted just become one of them. 5x plus 2. That's it. That's our answer. Let me explain that in a little bit more detail just to make sure you got that. Remember with factoring and distributing, they're like backwards versions of each other, right? You guys get what I'm saying? They're backwards versions of each other. Kind of like multiplying and dividing are backwards versions. Like you could do 5 times 3 and get 15, and then you could do divided by 3 and get 5, then times 3 and get 15, and you could go like back and forth like this all day long. Right? That makes sense? You could like eternally go back and forth. It's the same thing with distributing and with factoring, right? So it's like I could do the FOIL version of this and I would get this. And then I could factor this and it'd go back to that, right? That makes sense? Yeah? So if I did FOIL for this thing, this is what I would end up getting, right? So it's just that a backwards version of that. All right? So let's talk about this again, make sure we understand what we did, and then I'll have you guys try one. The first thing, we put them into 2 groups. Next, we would factor each one as common factors. After you do that, you're going to check to see the parentheses, see if they're the same thing. If they are, then you put them together. We'll talk about what to do if they're not in a second. Let's have you guys try another one. And I want you guys to try this on your own. I'll give you a little clue with this. There's no common factors first. Just start doing the grouping. Again, try it out on your own right now. All right, it's okay if you're not done. Compare what you did with the people around you. Ready, set, go. All right, it's okay if you're not done. Let's go over this. So, step 1, put the grouping signs in. Step 2, factor each of them. 3 and 12, what's in common? X to the third and x squared. 3 times 1, and then x squared times x. I'm cool. I'm just going to write x, not 1x. 3 times a negative 4 makes negative 12, and there's already an x squared. Now, after we do the common factors, we're going to hope that it also gets x minus 4. Let's see, between 2 and 8, what's in common? 2 times x, 2 times negative 4. We're going to check the parentheses. Do they match? Yes. Now we can just group them together. 3x squared plus 2, x minus 4. Easy enough, huh? All right. We're going to do one more, and we're going to see what happens when potentially those two things in the parentheses maybe don't match. And we'll talk about things that you can do if they don't match. Oops. So step 1, throw in the parentheses. Again, notice that I'm getting that sign in the second set of parentheses. That's an important piece of it, right? Do you guys see this? That sign, you have to put it inside the parentheses. So between 6 and 3, this is 3x squared. Right, I'm going to go through this first part a little bit faster. 2x plus 1. Now, between 10 and 5, what's in common? 5, right? So I could write plus 5. 5 times what makes negative 10x? Negative 2x. And 5 times what makes negative 5? Negative 1. Now let's check. Do they match? No, they're kind of match, though. What's different about them? Yes, someone said the right word there. They're opposites, right? A long time ago, when I first started talking about opposites with you, what do we say opposites are in math? Opposites are negatives. So instead of taking out the 5, we can just take out -5. And then we'll see -5 times +2 makes -10. And -5 times +1 makes -5. Now do the parentheses match? Yes. 3x squared minus 5, 2x plus 1. Now, the only thing that's going to be maybe a little bit different, and I want you to look out for, it happens a couple times in your homework. Let's just pretend, and I'm going to fast forward till the answer. All right, you don't need to write this in your notes. You just pay attention on something that could happen. Again, you don't need to write this down. So let's pretend I've got a problem here, and I split it up, and I factor each one of them, and I put them all out, and I end up getting something like this. X squared minus 9 times 2x plus 3. Does anyone notice something about the answer? There's a difference of squares there. So you would have to continue factoring that. X squared minus 9. You should know a difference of squares instantly. How do we factor x squared minus 9? X plus 3, x minus 3. Right? And then this one we would just copy out. So there's the potential for, I think there's like 2 of them, 3, something like that, 1, 2, or 3 problems where you'll have to factor it a second step that's in there. That's it for factoring. You now know all of the steps of factoring. Now we just got to practice it a bunch. This needs to become something like adding or subtracting. That might be an exaggeration, but it needs to be something where you are able to be an expert in factoring. Because again, in the next unit, in chapter 9, we're going to have like 7 steps to solving quadratic equations. One of those steps will be factor. And so when I say factor, what I'm really saying is all of this stuff. All right, so now we just got to do a whole bunch of practicing starting tonight, practicing with grouping.